Good evening, everybody. The Music Fan is back, bringing smiles to the faces, knowledge to the people, and most importantly, music to the masses. And I am back to continue my deep dive into the Album of the Year.org's consensus top 50 list. So last time we went over 50 to 26, and now we are looking at 25 to 1. Already we've seen some good stuff, some kind of overrated stuff, and some stuff that definitely need to be higher on the list. Now we are looking at the top half, and you're going to start seeing that the points are getting more and more spaced out, so you're going to see more consensus up top. So let's dive in. This album, for me, should have been a dream come true. I loved Halsey's last album, was in my top 50, I believe maybe even top 40 of that year. And with help from Trent Reznor, of all people, from Nine Inch Nails, this should have been a slam dunk. I love Nine Inch Nails. I love the production from them from a lot of albums. I thought this was going to work out. And there are a lot of really solid songs on here. Don't get me wrong. The tradition is just works so perfectly with Halsey's voice and the combination of the bread and butter that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross has created over the years. As great as this album could have been, it just didn't reach my expectations. It still made around my honorable mentions list, but it could have been so much better, and to me makes it a little bit disappointing, but still worth a listen. Number 24, with 105 points, we have Black Country New Road, and For the First Time. This album blew me away as a debut album from this band. This album, along with Black Midi and another album that's coming up soon, show that there's a lot of really good life in the post-punk movement. This album, from start to finish, is such an interesting ride of depravity and just a lot of different musical changes. This album is only 6 tracks long, but it's worth every minute. This definitely made my list. Number 23, with 107 points, we have St. Vincent and Daddy's Home. This was a lot of fun, to be honest. There was a lot of ties back to 70s and 60s rock, as well as some Beatle worship at times, but there was a lot of flair for the dramatic throughout this whole entire album, and a lot of really good storytelling. My favorite particular song on here is Daddy's Home, the kind of burlesque, Broadway-esque song talking about her issues with her dad, who in this point in time is in jail. So really interesting album, definitely worth the hype. Number 22, with 112 points, we have The War on Drugs and I Don't Live Here Anymore. This is my first dive into The War on Drugs. Again, a band that I have heard of a lot of, but never really took a listen to. And I was kind of surprised. These people kind of remind me of Wilco in a way, and there is some really solid storytelling. It is a little bit linear at times, a little bit one note, but still a decent listen, and one that I can definitely see myself listening to again. Number 21, with 118 points, we have Squid and Bright Green Field. Another one of these post-punk albums that just worked really well with me this time around. Just really zany at times, really interesting. Yeah, there are some points that are just kind of a little bit too monotone or a little bit out of left field for me, but overall, a really fun listen and definitely made some part of my list. Number 20, with 123 points, we have Nick Cave and Warren Ellis with Carnage. I've liked some of the latest Nick Cave albums, though I still have never checked out the previous work. I have liked Ghost Teen and parts of those trilogy of albums. This one just didn't really work for me. I think it just felt a little bit too over the top at times in terms of the arrangements. Not that they were bad, it just didn't stick with me. I can see why people like this album. It just wasn't for me this time around. Number 19, with 127 points, we have Adele with 30. This was a solid album. There's a lot of tinges of jazz and R&B. A lot of surprises to me. Oh My God was a really fun song and something that I didn't really expect to hear from her. But we all know the highlight of the album, Easy on Me, one of the best songs of the year. Still shows that over the years that she can still really kill a song with her vocals. The story of the album is also pretty interesting. Her dealing with breaking up with her partner and being a single mom, really heartbreaking at times, and her trying to find her way as a single mom. It definitely is making my list in some shape or form. You'll just have to find out where. Number 18, with 128 points, we have Snail Mail with Valentine. This one did not do well for me at all. I think there are some good songs like Valentine and Headlock and See et al., but for the most part, there's a lot of songs that just don't really show off her voice in a really interesting way. And there's just, in terms of a lot of indie that came out this year, this one just doesn't really stand out, which is a shame because I did like Lush, and so I was hoping that this album would have come off a little bit better. Number 17, though, with 129 points, we have Lucy Dacus and Home Video. This is a killer album. I don't want to say much just yet, but the storytelling on here is phenomenal. There's a lot of really memorable songs, and this for sure is making my list. Number 16, with 137 points, we have Mudo Mokhtar with Afrik Fikdim. This was a decent album. I'm glad I got a chance to listen to it, but I'm going to be honest, and with all the albums I listened to this year, this didn't really stand out. It was an interesting instrumental album at times, but there's just a lot more that stuck in my mind. If I give it another chance, maybe it would have made a little bit more of an impression, but at this point in time, I don't really have a lot to say about it. Number 15, with 137 points, we have Little Nas X with Montero. This surprised the hell out of me. I was not at all a fan of Old Town Road, so I wasn't really going to listen to this particular album, but this one surprised the hell out of me. From start to finish, you have a lot of depth and a lot of great songs. This definitely made my list. Number 14, with 139 points, and this is kind of surprising to me, is Billie Eilish with Happier Than Ever. Are there some really solid songs on this particular album? Yes, I think Happier Than Ever is a beautiful song. Everybody Dies is a really heartbreaking song about mortality and the idea of wanting to live if you know that everyone will die eventually. That's really crushing. But at the end of the day, this album isn't as interesting production wise, nor is it as consistent as When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? I think there's some interesting ideas about stardom and getting to where you want to be, and the crushing nature of paparazzi at times. There's a monologue from her talking about her body and how others portray it, which is really eye-opening. There's a lot of really interesting growth on here. I do like that there is more of a jazz approach to this album so that Billie Eilish can show off her voice a little bit more. However, this didn't really hit the same way that When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go hit. Not that it's a bad album, it just didn't hit those expectations. And to be honest, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on it, I think Phineas put out a better album than Billie Eilish did this time around. Honestly, also, if you're looking for an album that talks about the idea of fame and the complications that it can have, Montero might be the way to go on that one. Still, decent album. I would love to see what happens with her the next time around because I think she does have a bright future. I just don't think this was the best second album for her. Number 13 with 152 points, we have Self-Esteem and Prioritize Pleasure. This album has an absolutely gorgeous song, and I do this all the time, talking about building yourself up and breaking yourself down again. There are some beautiful songs on here, but there's also a lot of head-scratching songs on here. I feel like she's trying to be Madonna at times and a little bit too over the top at times, and that might work for some people, but for me, it's just not really interesting. So as much as I do like some of the songs on the album, for me, it's really hard to get fully into this album. Number 12, with 161 points, we have The Weather Station and Ignorance. This album, I wish was better than it actually is. I think there's some beautiful ideas talking about climate change and the state of the world in a lot of different allegories, like The Robber or I Tried to Tell You. But on the whole, I find it a little bit boring. Some nice efforts, but this album's just not for me. Number 11, with 187 points, we have Wolf Alice and Blue Weekend. I do like this album a lot. There are some songs on the front half that I really enjoy, like Smile with its 90s glam rock appeal, or my favorite song on the album, which is Safe from Heartbreak If I Never Fall in Love. But on the whole, this album kind of ends a little bit weak. So even though it made my honorable mentions, it just missed being able to be in my top 50. All right, we are in the top 10, and we're starting off with 187 points, Jasmine Sullivan and Hotels. Never heard of Jasmine Sullivan before, though apparently she has done some work in the early 2000s. This was an interesting look on the exotic dancers' occupation, as well as the stigma behind it. But musically, it didn't fully grasp me the whole entire time. Maybe a couple more listens would have put more on my radar, but it is still worth a listen, if not for the interesting stories from a lot of exotic dancers on this album. There's actually interviews throughout with certain dancers talking about their particular stories. So it is an interesting album, just didn't really get on my radar, and I didn't really have enough time to get it onto my radar. Number 9, with 208 points, we have Arlo Parks with Collapsed in Sunbeams. Hell yes, this album is killer. A lot of this album has this nice chill R&B vibe, but even with the chillness, there's a lot of really sad songs on here about depression and suicidal thoughts and trying to be there for a friend. It's absolutely gorgeous and heartbreaking at times. This made my list, and I can't wait to talk about it a little bit more in depth when we get to number 8. With 208 points, we have Turnstile and Glow On. This, at first, I did not really find the appeal of, but as I listened to it more and more, this became instantly one of my favorite pop punk albums of the year, and in a couple of years. I really like the approach here in terms of using a little bit more electronic work, being a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, and having this a little bit of a cloud of wonderment coming from this album. A lot of really catchy songs. Definitely made my list. Definitely we'll talk about it a little bit more in detail as we go on. Number 7, with 213 points, we have Dry Cleaning and New Long Leg. I don't get this one. I'm sorry. This one did not appeal to me at all. This was a little bit interesting music work, but the approach of the vocalist in the spoken word, it all just didn't really gel with me. I am very curious if anyone else had listened to this album, and if so, what their thoughts are on it, because maybe I'm just completely missing it. Maybe another try, I could say, hey, this, at least I can feel the appeal here, but this is probably the one that is the biggest perpetrator of I don't get. Maybe it's for others, but it's definitely not for me. Number 6, with 231 points, we have Low and Hey What. This is interesting because I think the previous album I liked more, and this one I think got a better consensus than the previous album. I like the continuity between songs on this album, and I feel like there's a little bit more atmospheric work than in previous albums. But I don't like this as much as the previous album. It still made my list, but it is a little bit of a disappointment if I was to be honest. Number 5, with 244 points, we have Olivia Rodrigo and Sour. This album has been everywhere. You have Driver's License, you have Good For You, my personal favorite song on there, Favorite Crime, and I think this is a interesting album. This is an album coming from pain of a younger person believing that they had fallen in love with somebody and then they kind of pushed them aside for somebody new. There's a lot of really raw emotion and it comes through. I do enjoy this album. It made my honorable mentions, but I didn't necessarily enjoy it as much as everybody. But still, it is worth a listen, and I can definitely see why a lot of people like this album. Number 4, with 269 points, we have Japanese Breakfast and Jubilee. I think this is another one where if I gave it a little bit more time, I would have liked it a little bit more. I think there's a lot of songs that have really, really beautiful arrangements. I don't think her voice is always as interesting, and I think there's some songs on here where if she's pulling it on her own, if the arrangement is sparse, her vocals don't really do much for me. But that being said, still an album worth listening to. I don't like it as much as everybody else, but that's just my opinion. Number 3 with 271 points, we have Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders and the London Symphony Orchestra with Promises. This album is quite an experience. I don't want to give away too much. I'll just say that this made my list, made it very high, and I can definitely understand why this album has gotten so much acclaim. This is a really interesting and minimalist jazz album, but it is very meditative, and if you just put it on and go all the way through, because that's the way you have to listen to this, you have to listen to it all the way through. It basically forces you to do it in terms of how they do the tracking. If you do that, you're going to get a reward from this album. So it definitely has warranted all of the attention that it's gotten. Number 2 with 299 points, we have Tyler the Creator with Call Me If You Get Lost. At first, I did not find the appeal of this album. I think Igor kind of like turned me off a little bit. I enjoyed it and it still made my top 50, but if I was to be honest, I love Flower Boy more. I think the lo-fi nature of Igor didn't really do much for me. So when I first listened to this, I was like, okay, this is good, but just, a dime a dozen rap album. But giving a second and a third chance, I found the appeal of this album, and it's the appeal of finding everything that you want in life and coming off as this bravado-ish person when really you're still trying to find what makes you happy, because it's not the materialistic things, it is the love of others. If everything that I've read is true, this character that Tyler is playing throughout is a really interesting character, and it makes for more depth on this particular album. So made my list. I'll go over more as we go on, but this has warranted the attention that it got, and I could easily see anyone saying that this is their album of the year ever. With almost 70 points more, at number 1 with 374 points, we have Little Sims and Sometimes I Might Be Introvert. I don't usually agree when it comes to the number 1 albums on these lists, usually because my number 1 albums tend to be more metal. That's what I listen to a lot of. But if I'm to be honest, this is the closest that they've ever gotten with this particular list. This album from Little Sims is phenomenal. The production throughout all of it, going from having more stereotypical hip-hop ideas at the beginning with a little bit more bombast from the arrangements, to having a little bit more African beats in the latter half to detail where her culture has come from. Because this album details a lot about her path through the rap game, as well as her thoughts on it, her introverted nature, her loneliness, and her wanting to find a partner, dealing with her family and her upbringing. Ties it all into one giant album with a lot of different parts and a lot of different ideas musically. There's even a lot of interludes that kind of play on the Alice in Wonderland trope. This is a gargantuan album with a lot of different approaches, but they all work. I really enjoy this album. It's not my favorite of the year. We'll get to that eventually, but trust me when I say this, this is a worthy spot on a lot of people's lists, and I can 100% agree there. So that's my dive into this list. Like I said before, my biggest gripe is there's not at all really any hard rock or metal albums. There's barely any jazz to begin with as well. You really only get one with the Pharoah Sanders and Floating Points album. It is a jazz album, but if you listen to it, it's not like a standard jazz album. So those are my biggest gripes, but this is still a decent list. I'm glad that there isn't like a lot of super pop albums on here, and when they are deserving, but I would just love a little bit more diversity, and that just also just might mean that we need to get more album of the year lists that include metal and hard rock on them, so that you get the big approach, because there were some really solid metal and hard rock albums, and I will be talking about them as we go on. Stay tuned for that. If you did enjoy this video, 3 things that you can do. one, like this video. Second, let me know some albums that you enjoyed in 2021, some albums that you hated, what you think of my opinions on this particular list. And third, and most important, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. That way I know that you enjoy what I'm doing and want to see this channel become bigger and better for the future. So I'll be back later. Next up is going to be my top 50 songs of the year. Until then, this is Music Fan, and I'm signing off.